I would ask you to remain standing as Professor Winston Purdy sings the two national anthems.
O Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all thy sons command. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, the true north strong and free. Ton histoire est une épopée des plus brillants exploits, et ta valeur de foi trompée protégera nos foyers et nos droits. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hail at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight? Oh, the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave? Oh, the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Good morning to our distinguished guests, and everyone here this morning is a distinguished guest. Je vous souhaite le bienvenue à McGill et à cette cérémonie. This morning's convocation is a capstone event, a fitting conclusion to a historic gathering. Friends of this great university have come together to share their leadership experience, to learn how their support is transforming McGill, et trouver dans les réalisations de nos étudiants et professeurs une véritable source d'inspiration pour mieux négocier les enjeux du monde aujourd'hui. Perhaps no one understands those global challenges better than our honoree, former United States President Bill Clinton. Both during his term in office and since leaving it, he has worked diligently, just as we do at McGill, to share knowledge and inspire others to achieve solutions to real-world problems. Today, he joins an outstanding roster of influential figures who have been recognized with honorary degrees from McGill. I now invite Provost Anthony Massey to confirm the degree on behalf of the Senate. Provost Massey.
Thank you, Mr. Chancellor. While it is normally the custom of McGill University to confer honorary degrees in our spring and fall convocations, this special and unique event, as part of our Leadership Summit, allows us, and we are delighted to, award this degree today. As Provost of McGill University, and by virtue of the powers conferred upon me by the University Senate, I declare that on the 20th of May, 2009, the University Senate resolved that the degree of Doctor of Laws, honoris causa, be bestowed upon President William Jefferson Clinton. En ma qualité de vice-principal exécutif de l'Université McGill et en vertu des pouvoirs qui me sont conférés par le Sénat, je déclare que le 20 mai 2009, le Sénat de l'Université a décidé de décerner le grade de docteur en droit honoris causa au President William Jefferson Clinton. I now invite Principal and Vice Chancellor Heather Monroe Bloom to introduce our most distinguished honorary degree recipient.
Bonjour et bienvenue à nos invités distingués, chers collègues, chers amis. William J. Clinton. We honor today William Jefferson Clinton, 42nd President of the United States of America, a global leader and human rights champion of extraordinary breadth and vision. In so doing, we celebrate the achievements of a man recently dubbed an exuberant American original. President Clinton's exceptional and multifaceted career has displayed an extraordinary evolution as lawyer, politician, humanitarian, philanthropist, public speaker, best-selling author, and saxophonist. A simply brilliant communicator on the world stage, President Clinton has dedicated over 30 years to the highest form of public service and to the advancement of social justice. He has advocated powerfully and compassionately for progressive education programs and universal access to health care. He has fought to end poverty, disease, and racial discrimination. President Clinton's book, My Life, describes the challenging vicissitudes of his early life and his simply remarkable ascent to state, national, and indeed world leadership. His story is a story in personal resilience, determination, and unflagging optimism, and it is an expression of his fierce idealism, and this continues to drive him in his public service today. Born in Hope, Arkansas in 1946, William Clinton received a Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University and then won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University, where he studied philosophy, politics, and economics. After graduating from Yale Law School in 1973, he taught law at the University of Arkansas before being elected Attorney General of Arkansas in 1976. 2 years later, at the remarkably young age of 32, he was elected the 40th governor of Arkansas, becoming the youngest governor ever in the history of that state. Continuing his meteoric political ascent, Mr. Clinton secured the Democratic Party nomination and in 1992 triumphed in the American presidential election against George H.W. Bush and Ross Perot. As president, Mr. Clinton was deeply committed to the renewal of the United States of America. His two-term presidency, spanning the years 1993 to 2001, was characterized by sustained prosperity, a budget surplus, the creation of over 22 million jobs, and a profoundly positive influence on national and international policy. Pretty appealing. Charged with the vision, courage, and empathy to reform education, health and welfare programs, and to promote equality of opportunity, President Clinton championed values he held from very early on in his life and first expressed during his days as a student leader in government at Georgetown University. Balanced pragmatism also shaped his public policy directions. Mr. Clinton demonstrated great proficiency in domestic politics and achieved strong results and strong approval ratings as president. He was also a globally minded president, and he has continued to have a powerful influence on the world stage. Indeed, he achieved outstanding success in foreign affairs. Both his presidential and post-presidential careers exemplify the manner in which transformative leadership can transcend national boundaries. President Clinton's constructive and warm relationship with Canada's then Prime Minister Jean Chrétien led to multilateral and bilateral ratifications between our two countries, including the North American Free Trade Agreement, which addressed long-standing disagreements and encouraged economic growth shared in both Canada and the United States. President Clinton's long-standing commitment to the international community is also expressed in his work as founder and chairman of the William J. Clinton Foundation, which this fall marks its 12th anniversary. Its initiatives on climate change, sustainable development, and the treatment of HIV, AIDS, and malaria have brought practical solutions to seemingly intractable global challenges. At the same time, these important initiatives are also pilot projects of a new model of public social entrepreneurship, which bring the best of business practices and experience to the benefit of effective distribution of public goods. President Clinton's visionary outlook for the broader community continues to guide his priorities. After serving as UN Special Envoy for Tsunami Recovery from 2005 to 2007, he was recently named the United Nations Special Envoy to Haiti as part of an effort to rebuild that country. President Clinton's outstanding leadership initiatives have garnered him numerous great honors and awards. He's been awarded honorary doctorates of laws and humane letters from a host of distinguished universities, and in 2005, the University of Arkansas System opened the Clinton School of Public Service on the grounds of the Clinton Presidential Center in his honor. That same year, he was awarded the distinguished J.W. Fulbright Prize for International Understanding, and in 2006, he was named Honorary Chief and Grand Companion of the Order of Laguhu by Papua New Guinea. For his contributions to the advancement of global freedom and human rights, he received the International Freedom Conductor Award in 2007, the highest honor granted by the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. A perennially active and popular leader, President Clinton has also been named to Gallup's list of widely admired people of the 20th century, an honor he shares with Mother Teresa, Mahatma Gandhi, and Albert Einstein, among other notables. With his active dedication to humanitarian causes and his strong advocacy of entrepreneurial philanthropy, President Clinton's current work and his legacy remain unfinished. Indeed, as one American writer has suggested, history may best remember Bill Clinton as a philanthropist who happened to have been president. Today, we celebrate this inspirational global leader, and I'm honored to join with all of you assembled in welcoming President Bill Clinton into the McGill community. I would like to mark this extraordinary moment in McGill's history by making a special mention that this is the second time a U.S. president has received an honorary degree from McGill. In 1944, at the height of the Second World War, on the site of their private Quebec City conference of that year, a unique convocation ceremony was held in Quebec City, during which McGill granted degrees to then U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. I can imagine today how my predecessor, Cyril James, felt on that special day. And so on this remarkable day in the modern history of McGill, and in the presence of Mr. Clinton's friend and our alumnus, Dr. Victor Dahdaleh, and all assembled, it is with great McGill pride and deep personal pleasure that I now call upon our Chancellor, Arnold Steinberg, to bestow upon President William J. Clinton the university's highest honor, the degree of Doctor of Laws, honoris causa.
It's now with the greatest of pleasure, I have no doubt to this entire audience as well, that I welcome Dr. Clinton to the lectern to give his address.
Thank you very much, Chancellor, Madam Principal, Secretary General Lynn Thibault, my great friend Victor Dahdaleh, ladies and gentlemen, members of the board, thank you for welcoming me and giving me this honor. I'm going to do something supremely undignified. I have been studying the robed men here and wondering how they wear this without choking. And I learned that what they did was to put their ties through. So I'm going to, I may not be worthy of the degree, but at least I'm a good student. When the principal was kind enough to present the better aspects of my biography, there were two things that she left out. First of all, shortly after I got out of law school, I was myself a university professor. And I was the youngest member of the faculty at the University of Arkansas, where I became famous for being willing to teach more different courses than anyone else on the faculty. One of my critics said that was because I knew nothing about any of them. The other thing that I think is important is that when I was president, I came to Canada more than any American president in the history of our country. And I say that because it was really important to me. And when we were walking up the stairs, your principal said to me, you know, you seem to share Canadian values. There were many occasions when leaders of the Republican Party suggested that I might want to move to Canada. And many when I thought it was not a bad idea. I am profoundly honored to be here at this magnificent university and to be honored in the way that President Roosevelt was honored. I think it's worth beginning by saying that I am particularly grateful for the priority that McGill has placed on making serious commitments to broadly shared prosperity, sustainability in the face of climate change, reaping the progress and promise of science and technology, promoting wellness and health, and trying to deal with the amazing array of diversity that exists in our country and throughout the world that has to be both respected and reconciled. I found it very interesting that amid all the things that might have been picked out about the people who've been kind enough to give me some award or another, the principal mentioned the award I got from Papua New Guinea. And I noticed some of you chuckling. If you've never been there, you ought to go. But the interesting thing is that little country, comprising just a little more than half of the island of New Guinea, the rest being the Papua province of Indonesia, contains half of all the languages still spoken on planet Earth. A stunning statistic. And a good departure point for my remarks today. I was asked to come there by the government to do the AIDS work we do. because they have the highest infection rate in Asia, even though it's quite low by African standards, a little over 2%. And I thought it was especially important to do because of the phenomenal diversity packed into a small place. The reason they have managed to preserve so many languages is that they have the highest percentage of people who've never been more than 10 miles from where they were born. The flip side of that is that they're vulnerable to every sort of invasive organism. And they're vulnerable to deforestation. They're vulnerable to careless mining. They're vulnerable. And it would be a shame if, before any of these languages could be recorded, they would follow the path of so many other hundreds of spoken tongues where people communicated and raised their children and did their work and made their common decisions. And we now have no record of them. So I thank you for mentioning that. The thing I always liked about Canada was that it seemed to me that in many ways it was like America with one fundamental difference for the last 25 years. I mean, you have Canadian cowboys, you have Canadian miners, you have great native populations, you have vast expanses of unoccupied land, you have clashing cultures. You even have occasional votes about whether you ought not to be together. I'm glad you didn't get a divorce, by the way. It's a great thing about not being president. You can say whatever you want. Of course, nobody cares what you have to say anymore, but you can say it at least. There was a great appreciation for individualism, a great belief in the power of free enterprise, and yet there was a certain communitarianism that persisted in this country that has been lacking in America, but has been building steadily there for the last 10 years. And communitarianism is neither left nor right. It just simply recognizes that we are mutually dependent on each other, that it is inconceivable that we can find personal or fulfillment or family success unless we have some concern and care for the general conditions under which we all live. And when people ask me to explain the results of the last election and the prophetic one that occurred in 2006, which basically predetermined how this one would come out, I said that we had become a more communitarian country. We hadn't necessarily moved left, we just decided we were going to move forward together. And I would like to make the argument today that that is basically the mission we have to undertake for the world. Now, in America, we call the far right the black helicopter crowd. They used to be convinced that the liberals in my country were in favor of the United Nations taking over the United States with an invasion of people in black helicopters. That's what that refers to. I'm not calling for world governance. I'm just saying that we have to have a world consciousness. And in the absence of it, we will not make good decisions. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that everything in the world should be solved in a multilateral way. Let me give you just one example. Today is World Food Day. And I'm sad that the donations to the World Food Program, because of the global financial crisis, are at their lowest levels in 20 years because there are a lot of hungry people out there. But I am heartened that in the last couple of years, the president of the World Bank, Robert Zoellick, not a member of my party, but a smart and able man, recognized that the world had made a mistake in 1981 when all of the wealthy agricultural producers, including the United States and Canada and Europe, led the world away from using foreign assistance to promote agricultural self-sufficiency in poor countries on the theory that the staples of life, wheat and rice, soybeans, corn, could be produced more efficiently in countries that had massive agricultural infrastructure and good topsoil, and therefore it was possible for people in poor countries to just skip the agricultural stage of their development and move right into some sort of industrial age and just get their food from somewhere else, which they could buy cheaper than they could grow. And this view persisted among policymakers for 25 years or more. Parenthetically, it also made a lot of money for the farmers in the United States, Canada, Europe, and elsewhere. And they did do a good job, but it led to some bizarre developments. For example, most of you probably know that every couple of years there's a famine in the Horn of Africa, which begins in Ethiopia, eastern Ethiopia, and we all have to rush to give more food aid. I work in Ethiopia now. We have 166 people working there, building out health systems so that our AIDS program and anti-malaria programs and maternal and child health programs will actually work. And a couple of years ago, I was there flying out into rural areas looking at the clinics that our foundation has helped to set up. And everywhere south of Addis Ababa, the capital, which is slightly east of center in the north of Ethiopia, and west, there was a bumper crop. And yet, 2 months after I got home, there's another fire alarm for food for the Horn of Africa. Why? They had no means of storing the crop. They had no transportation mechanisms. They had no distribution mechanisms. No one had ever helped them to build the infrastructure of a modern food chain that would have provided food by and large organically grown, locally grown, would have contributed to the income of farmers where in the villages where a lot of this food was grown, they grew far more than they needed for their own consumption. And so at the end, everybody was out here riding to the rescue. Now, Canada deserves a great deal of credit, I might add, for changing its policy on food aid. Yours used to mirror ours, and we used to both require that food aid came from food grown by our farmers and delivered, so that our taxpayers were at least paying for our own food. And it helped to support high production levels and reasonable prices. But the food took too long to get too far, it was too expensive, and it did nothing to support development. So now you spend about half your food aid buying the food grown next nearest the crisis. And I applaud you for that. For all of our disagreements, President Bush, I think, deserved a lot of credit when he proposed that at least 25% of America's aid be delivered in the same way you deliver half of yours. And he was defeated by this overwhelming bipartisan consensus of special interest in Washington. I was virtually the only Democrat who was on his side. There we were. We disagreed on everything. We finally agreed on something, and we got our brains beat out. But I say that because now that I am doing the work I do now, when we undertook to do development projects in Africa and Latin America, it became clear to me that the whole thing was a fool's errand unless we increase people's capacity to feed themselves, to store food, to transport food, to work out delivery mechanisms, to have an efficient supply chain. Farmers are good everywhere. They know what they're doing, and they know how to take care of the soil. It's the structure of feeding people. What happens, and whether you get good seed and whether you have adequate fertilizer and all of that, that holds it up. I say that because on this World Food Day, if part of the mission of McGill is sustainability, there is no better place to start. And it is now a necessity. In the last 10 years, with the world population growing, the only places on earth where grain yields per acre increased significantly were in Brazil and Argentina, the only places left on earth with more than 20 feet of topsoil to farm on. And even there are constraints to how much yields can further increase. So when it comes to having a communitarian outlook and being committed to sustainability, on Food Day, we should say we're glad that Canada and the United States have great farmers and lush land and the capacity to feed much of the world. But we know in our heart of hearts it would be better if more people could feed themselves. Then when we give food aid, we'll know it's an absolute necessity, and they'll know we still want them to have the dignity and the self-respect of being able to maximally support themselves wherever they are. Which brings me to the larger point. The reason that a communitarian consciousness is needed in the world today is that the whole world is interdependent to an extent it has never been before. Before World War I, the wealthy countries of the world were actually as trade dependent as they are now. Actually, as of today, more trade dependent than they are today, but as trade dependent as they were before the economic crisis of the last year. But they were not nearly as interdependent when it came to travel and communication and the movement of capital. And of course, there was no internet, and therefore the sharing of information and the ability to have a common knowledge base across a wide range of areas did not exist. It didn't even really exist when I became president. There were only 50 sites on the World Wide Web when I took office. Shoot, there have been more than that added since I've been talking. The average cell phone weighed 5 pounds when I became president. Not in 1939, in 1993. So there's never been anything like this. But we know that there are significant problems with the world in which we live. We know it is too unequal, with half the world living on less than $2 a day, and 1 billion people going to bed hungry, and 1 billion people having no access to clean water, and 2.5 billion people having no access to sanitation, and 130 million people never going to school, children, and way more than that going to school without trained teachers or learning materials. The inequality in education, economics, and healthcare are enormous. 1 in 4 people this year will die, who die on Earth, will die of AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and infections related to dirty water, the diseases of the poor. You don't know anybody who's going to die of any of those things unless you have a friend with AIDS who's, unfortunately, the medicine doesn't work anymore, the second-line medicine doesn't work, or they don't keep the regime. 80% of the people who die from waterborne diseases are 5 years of age or younger. And all these things are cheaply remediable. Within wealthy countries, in most wealthy countries, inequality has increased in the last now 37 years since the world went off, America went off the gold standard, and we began to develop a real global financial system. A lot of the growth has been concentrated in finance. Too little has been concentrated in broadly shared prosperity, so most societies have seen increases in inequality. One of the reasons that America was set up to take a fall with this financial crisis is before it occurred, 2/3 of the American people after inflation had a lower income than they did the day I left office. Median income was $2,000 lower in real dollar terms before the financial crisis. While after inflation, healthcare costs had doubled and the cost of a university education had gone up 75%. Here's the most important bad economic statistic about America nobody knows. From the end of World War II, when Franklin Roosevelt's idea was of creating a universal access to college system through the GI Bill was actualized by Harry Truman and the Congress. From that date until 2001, the United States every single year had the highest percentage of young people between the ages of 25 and 34 with four-year college degrees of any place in the world. So as we had wave after wave of immigrants, we had all kinds of problems in our cities, and our public education system didn't perform particularly well. If you look at the scores today, American kids are internationally competitive at the 4th grade level. Then measured again at the 8th and 11th grade level, they're way behind most places. So we always caught up by sending more people on to higher education. In this decade, my country's fallen from 1st to 10th in the world in the percentage of young adults with four-year degrees. And one big reason is the delivery system is not sustainable. It costs too much money for too many people, particularly if their families have flat incomes. Now, this inequality problem cannot be solved by anybody alone. It requires a communitarian mentality and a common strategy. The second problem the world has is it is highly unstable. You see that in the panic globally over swine flu, which can have quite a high mortality rate when infecting people that have no immunities. And I've learned a lot about flu immunity I didn't know. I've read all the major books about the so-called Spanish influenza epidemic after World War I, which actually started on an Army base in Kansas, not in Spain. One of the last times we ever got to shift the blame. But this influenza is interesting because even if you haven't been exposed to it, if you're over 50, you've been exposed to so many other kinds of viruses that you build up what one expert said on American television. He used a term I'd never heard. He called it peripheral immunity. So he said if old guys like me are exposed to Spanish influenza, to the swine influenza, we'll get really sick, but it probably won't kill us. We lost a 29-year-old police officer in New York City about 2 months ago, a young, strapping guy in the prime of his life because he had no immunity whatever. So we worry about that. One big school district in Texas shut down the first time swine flu cases were reported in northern Mexico. They just shut down for several weeks until they were absolutely sure nobody had been exposed. When Hillary comes home on the weekend and we take our little walks around this small town we live in north of New York City, there was a period where total strangers would come up to us on the street and ask if it was safe to take their children to New York City to a Broadway play because we'd had one reported case at that time. Which means that in their intuitive instincts, people know that the interdependent world is unstable. It leaves them vulnerable from a health point of view. We see it in the concerns we all have about the proliferation of nuclear and chemical and biological materials, about the ability of Al-Qaeda, a non-state actor, not just to do 9/11, but to carry out operations in Spain and England and Indonesia and Bali, in the Hindu part of Indonesia. And of course, we see it in this financial crisis, which began in the United States, spread quickly to Britain and Ireland, which were more heavily leveraged in their financial institutions than we were, then totally engulfed and destroyed the government of tiny Iceland. Sadly, Iceland had the highest percentage of self-made millionaires of any country in Europe. Not from finance, from enterprise, traditional enterprise. But their government had permitted financial institutions to become so leveraged that they offered outlandish returns to pension plans, for example, in small English villages. And when it all came crashing down around their ears, the whole government was replaced at the same time. Then all of a sudden, China, which has no money problems, they were sitting on $2 trillion in cash reserves, much of which you and I gave them by buying Chinese products. They still had 35 million unemployed factory workers and worried deeply about real instability in the country because the rest of the world could no longer buy so many of their products. Capital flows, which reach $2 trillion a day worldwide, crossing national borders, have shrunk 75% in the wake of the global financial crisis. So this age of interdependence has been pretty good to most of us, or we wouldn't be sitting here. You just look around this room, there's more diversity in this room and more women in this room than there would have been if we'd had this meeting 30 years ago, right? We've gotten a lot of benefits out of it, but it is both unequal and unstable. And finally, because of climate change, it is unsustainable. There are a handful of people who still seriously question whether it's that big a problem, but that's what they are, a handful. Some of them are pretty distinguished. A distinguished American physicist, Freeman Dyson, an 83-year-old icon of American science, and a liberal Democrat who supported Barack Obama for president, says he just thinks everybody else is wrong. What I think is, I want my daughter and the grandchildren I hope to have to live on a planet that will sustain them and people just like them in every other part of the world. And I think I'll stay with the 95% and not the 5%. And I want to say a little more about that in a minute. But these are the challenges. And it is clear that they cannot be met unless we meet them together. And that they cannot be met to our benefit unless they are broadly beneficial. An interdependent world that is as unequal as ours is not sustainable. An interdependent world as unstable as ours is headed for rough waters. And an interdependent world that is unsustainable simply means that while the climate scientists can tell us that Australia is the first place to be being hit right now by the adverse effects of climate change, and that sub-Saharan Africa, which has done the very least to contribute to it, is going to be the next hardest hit, and that there are a lot of other poor countries that, for reasons of geography, like Haiti and Afghanistan, that are going to be hard hit. Eventually, it will engulf us all. Therefore, we have to find a way to go forward together. The other point I would like to make is finding a way to go forward together has to be about doing as well as talking. One of the great advances in the 21st century world is that the power of citizens to affect the course of their own destiny and the world's destiny is greater than it has ever been. It's not an excuse for governments not to have good policies. It's not an excuse for businesses not to be farsighted and effective and productive. It's simply a recognition that if you have a system which seeks to get the strengths of a market economy and individual incentives and productivity, with the government rounding off the rough edges and giving people the tools so that everybody can participate, it will always be, by definition, an imperfect system. It's too complicated. It's changing too fast. There are always going to be gaps between where we are and where we want to be. And in the last 20 years, more than at any time in history, non-governmental groups have arisen to try to fill those gaps. The NGO movement has run wild in the world in the last 15 years. It's one of the greatest things that's happened. America has 1 million foundations and 355,000 religious groups doing this kind of community work around the corner and around the world. 50% of these foundations were organized in the last 12 years. Now, India has over 500,000 native Indian foundations, and that plus the ones from other countries make India, with 1 billion people, still the country with the highest per capita involvement of non-governmental groups in the world. They believe that they can change the world from the ground up. China has 400,000 registered non-governmental foundations and probably almost that many not registered because they're afraid for political reasons they might not be permitted to flourish. Even in Russia now, we're finally getting over 150,000 of them. People struggling to establish unions of like-minded people to do things that address our common challenges. The second most densely invaded country in the world per capita by non-governmental groups is Haiti, where both Canada and the United States, and especially this part of Canada, have a rich set of ties. And it's one of the reasons I think we've got the best chance in my lifetime to help Haiti escape the chains of its past. It is both open to the world and operating at a higher level of capacity than has been the case in the past. But when you have the ability to do something that is good, you have the moral responsibility to try to do it. And most of what I spend my time doing now is trying to get people to understand that you don't have to be president or a member of the parliament or Congress or prime minister to have a positive impact on the world, and you don't have to be rich either, because if you look at what's happened to internet giving across the spectrum, people, if a large number of people with a limited amount of money each agree that something is a problem, they can move the world. I just finished filling out a questionnaire on the airplane up here for something called the Dutch Postal Code Lottery. Now, they don't have lotteries in the Netherlands is a much more communitarian place in America. This might not fly at home. But individuals don't win the lottery in the Dutch Postal Code Lottery. The postal codes do. So there's a prize every month, and everybody lives in the postal code that buys a ticket, splits the prize. And the more of your neighbors that buy the ticket, the smaller your take is. Nobody gets to retire as a multimillionaire, but everybody gets a summer vacation. But the interesting thing is all of the profits are given in turn to non-governmental groups to work in the Netherlands, in Europe, and around the world. And they came to me wanting to participate in the climate change work that I was doing. So I was writing this questionnaire to thank them for helping me do the kinds of things we do in building retrofits, closing landfills in poor countries, doing clean public transit, everything you can think of. And I thought about this, these people are buying these little lottery tickets, and because so many of them buy it and so many of them share the benefits, they are moving lives half a world away, something they never could have done on their own, but with a communitarian attitude have found a way to do. I hope that sometime in my lifetime that the people who run an organization called Unitate win a Nobel Prize. After the Global Fund on AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria was set up, a lot of us who worked in it realized that even that wasn't enough money to deal with those three diseases, much less all the other tropical diseases of the poor that are killing people like flies in the world. And so the former foreign minister of France, Philippe Douste-Blazy, and others got together with this idea that the French should have a modest airline tax. It's 1 or 2 euros on every plane ticket out of France, only international tickets. And that all this would go into this Unitate fund, and that fund would be used to buy medicine to treat the diseases of the poor. Eventually, 26 other countries kicked in some money. Some of them had their own voluntary airline taxes. Some of them just gave a little money. It turns out to be a massive amount of money. And I work with them because we buy pediatric AIDS medicines for them, for the little children who cannot absorb the adult antiretrovirals. And then we buy the so-called second-line AIDS medicine for the 10% of the people who have to have medicine to stay alive, for whom the first medicine no longer works. Now, because these people were paying 1 or 2 euros to get on an airplane, they gave me the market power through Unitate, our foundation, to take the price of pediatric AIDS medicine from $600 a person a year to $60 a year. 2/3 of all the people in the world who get this medicine now get it because of these contracts that we negotiated, just while people are flying around on airplanes. If the mission of this university is to promote sustainability and widely shared prosperity and to deal with all these conflicts in the world, we have to find more ways to do this so that every single person feels that he or she is an active participant in embracing the challenges of our time. It is incredibly empowering. I mean, you go to the Netherlands now and you stop people on the street and say, "You buy a lottery ticket?" And say, "Yes, I do." And then they'll say, "And do you know what we do with that money?" They don't tell you whether they've ever won or not. They tell you what they're contributing to when they buy the lottery ticket. It's a really interesting mindset. We have to look for ways to actualize that. Every year I have this global initiative meeting in New York around the UN, and we bring in the big NGOs like the Gates Foundation and others, wealthy American philanthropists and others around the world, business leaders, and we invite all the world leaders who come and all the former leaders with whom I served, who I know still are active. I'll never forget the first year we had it after Prime Minister Chrétien left office. I'll tell you, it's an interesting story. He was quite at home in this forum, and we don't let anybody give a speech. No speeches, except the Secretary General of the United Nations and the American President, if they come, can speak for up to 10 minutes, no more. And when there's an election on, I invite them both. Otherwise, no speeches. And everyone sits around in panels and they just talk about how to solve problems and who should do what. And then at the end, they make commitments. And in 5 years, we've had 1,700 commitments involving probably 10,000 people in groups, worth about, over a 10-year period, $55 billion. And the implementation of those commitments have already helped in economic empowerment or healthcare or education or reconciliation or fighting climate change. We have counted, with a pretty conservative count, 220 million lives in 170 countries that have already been actually directly impacted. And people can give a little bit of money. And we try to get commitments, like Procter & Gamble gave us a lot of money with their little water purification packets. If you drop it in a bucket of water that's not polluted, it'll clean it up, and a family of 4 can live on it for 3 or 4 days. They cost 10 cents a piece. So we webcast it, and then people who have $10 to give can pledge $10 and buy 100 packets. We had a group called Sun Night Solar who makes solar flashlights. Originally, they started making them as solar flashlights. Then they realized in poor countries where most people are not on the electrical grid, they could light rooms. So now they're 3-way flashlights with a hook on the end. You just hang it up, and they'll light a whole room, and different kinds of light. So if you want to read, it's concentrated. If you want to work and do sewing or something at night, it's diffuse. They just gave me 500,000 of those lights for Haiti that will light 2.5 million lives at night. That's more than 25% of the whole country. Cost them maybe $5 million to do that. A lot cheaper than putting everybody on the electrical grid. And so these are things we can all do. Then a couple of years ago, we started doing it at just for university students, which they obviously have far less money, but sometimes they have much better ideas. And we just say, make a commitment. Last year, we had, at the University of Texas, 3 students from McGill, 14 from China, came all the way from China, 1 from Burma. That's a hilarious story. So we're at the University of Texas at Austin, right, which is predominantly in the Hispanic part of Texas. And we always do a community service project. So this last day, we went out to this Hispanic neighborhood where they had a community center that had been deteriorating, and we did a lot of cleanup there. And I was going around thanking the students, and this young man starts talking to me, and I said, "Where are you from?" He said, "Myanmar, Burma," he said. I said, "How did you get here?" He said, "You invited me, and I accepted." And I said, "But I saw the list of all, we fly a lot of people in, by the way. We fly to the Global Initiative, NGOs from poor countries. We cover their costs to make sure that everybody can be represented. And we fly a lot of students in that can't afford to come. And I said, but you weren't on the list. He said, no, I got myself here. He said, but I don't want to, and then he smiled and he said, I'm being a little bit misleading. He said, I was a student in London when I heard about this, and I applied, and you accepted me. And I said, why did you do this? So here's this kid from Burma cleaning up the yard for these poor Latinos in East Austin, Texas. And I said, why did you do this? He said, look, I know my country's all messed up. But he said, it's a beautiful place. They're good people. We have enormous potential. And in the end, people like me are going to have to change it. And we're going to have to take some risks to change it. Look what happened to the monks, he said. But we just have to keep pushing. And I came here to learn how to do it. Simple ideas to empower individuals. So 3 of your students came. And I'll just tell you, this is very interesting. One of them, Nate Andrew Ling, made the following commitment to establish something called Volunteer Niagara, which is simply an online database of service opportunities in this area, in the Niagara region, primarily targeted to high school students to get them started early doing this kind of work. It's a big deal. You'd be amazed how many people are willing to do things and don't know how to do it. Another group that I hope gets a big award sometime is Kiva.org. 2 Peace Corps volunteers met and fell in love when they were working in Africa and came home and decided that everybody in the world should be able to be a microcredit banker. So if you go on the Kiva website and you say, I'm interested in Afghanistan, you push Afghanistan, and all the registered business people in Afghanistan that need loans come up. And for $100, you can double a car repairman's business, and he can hire 2 more people. For $25, you can do it for a television repair person. And then every 2 weeks, you get a report on how your business is doing, and when they pay the money back, as 98% of them do, you get a notice, do you want your money back or you want to turn around and lend it to somebody else? These are the kinds of things that can be done in the world in which we live. And I say that to make this sort of simple statement. I have, as I get older, I keep trying to simplify things because I'm a policy wonk and I love the details. But if somebody asks me today, how do you stand on issue X? I may have the wrong position, I may get it wrong, but I'm sure I have the right filter. I ask myself one question every time. Will this build up the positive or reduce the negative forces of interdependence? If it will, I'm for it. If it won't, I'm against it. Now, determining what the facts are sometimes is difficult. Determining what the consequences of a particular course are sometimes is just educated guesswork. But at least if you start with the right filter, with the right framework, we have a chance to make the world that our children and grandchildren deserve. So that's what I ask you to think about. Canada and the United States built great, throbbing, vibrant countries, partly on the shoulders of a meritocracy. It's really what a great university is, isn't it? You find a child, a young boy or girl, without regard to their background, and you give them a chance to learn what they can learn and do what they dream of doing, and then it all adds up to something great. Nobody exactly organized it. They just do what people do, and when you look at it, it's beautiful and big and powerful and compelling. What I would like to say is that the intelligence you see in the young people in McGill can be found anywhere in the world. Intelligence is evenly distributed, and so are dreams. But structure, which gives predictability of consequence to action taken, and investment in opportunity or not. And it's simply going to be impossible for us to build the world we need unless in the wealthy countries we are ruthlessly honest about where we are wasting money and hanging on to yesterday's way of doing things. That's why I think we're going to get some kind of health care reform in America today. Finally, the deniability ran out, and all the bogus arguments don't cut much mustard anymore. When the health insurance companies made their last great effort to block reform last week, I got so frustrated I was giving a bunch of speeches, and I said, here's what their position amounts to. I said, we're spending 17% of our income almost on health care now. Next highest is Switzerland at 11.5%, and you're somewhere between 10.5% and 11%. And every other major country in the world is between 9 and 10. So if you add that up, it amounts to, in the numbers of our GDP, a $900 billion handicap we take into the global economy. So I said, I personally think it's immoral that we don't give everybody health insurance, and immoral that we leave 30% of the people that have health insurance at risk of losing it. But suppose you don't care anything about those people. Forget about them. To heck with your neighbors. You're spotting the competition, $900 billion, for nothing. I said, it's almost as if I said to the American people, I've decided I don't believe in the 22nd Amendment, and I'm going to run for a third term as president. Here's my platform. Vote for me. As soon as I get elected, I'm going to impose on you a $900 billion tax. And then, because nobody really knows how much money that is, I'm going to have the Treasury Department converted into cash, and I'm going to haul it out on the Capitol Mall on national television so you can see $900 billion. I will then get a mobile ladder which will take me up and down the pile of money, and I will sprinkle kerosene on it and set it afire. Vote for me. I didn't get many takers, but that's what we do. The problem with countries like ours is we cling to yesterday's way of doing things in the face of tomorrow's realities. The problem with really poor places is the lack of capacity to build the structures we take for granted. And both those things have to be attacked, which means there's a room for NGO action in Canada as well as in Haiti, in America as well as in Latin America and Africa. But the people are there. And now, because of the interdependent world, we can know them as we have never done before. And it really depends upon whether we understand how we relate to other people on earth, to people who have gone before and people who are not yet born. And I'll just close with a couple of stories and ask if you can imagine these kids, these people at McGill. The biggest problem in AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis care, particularly in AIDS now, we're still working on the affordability of good malaria medicine. And the Gates Foundation gave us a ton of money this year. We're working in 11 African countries on that. But the biggest problem in AIDS medicine now, in AIDS care, is not the cost and availability of the medicine. Nobody's going to die this year because of that. But a lot of people are going to die because there are no health systems out there. And it's not like a food airlift. You can't just drop the medicine out in the middle of a field and have people come woof it up. So we spent a lot of time working on this. And I was in Rwanda a couple of years ago where there was only one major hospital after the genocide, and our project now, with a wonderful man named Paul Farmer who runs Partners in Health and has worked in Haiti for 20 years, we brought the model to Rwanda. We now built 9 hospitals in all the regions and clinics, and then regional community workers. So I wanted to see the first point of contact. So one of these community workers who simply trained to take people medicine, check on, see whether they're doing it, bring it back to the testing facility, took me to this village that was really poor and really small and had one sort of little general store, you might say, if you could call it that. It's almost like just one little counter. And I went to the home of a 19-year-old girl and her 15-year-old brother. She had raised him, her brother, since she was 12 and he was 8. Both their parents had died of AIDS. She was free of the virus. He had it. It's a miracle that he was alive, because for most of his childhood, he didn't have access to the medicine or any care. He was much stunted in his growth and was so sick for his childhood that he'd only done 3 years of school. And our people there with our foundation loved these kids so much that they actually built them a new house, because they were living in a mud circle, about 6 times the square footage of this podium. It's unbelievable. They built them a nice house, 2 rooms, walk through, and you can cook outside in the back. So I said to the young woman, I said, do you have any dreams for your life? Do you have any plans? She said, well, you know, I spent my whole life being my brother's parent, sort of, taking care of him, and I'm so glad he's going to live. But she said, now that you mention it, I do. I want to own a store. Look around here. There's just nothing to buy in this town. I felt like I was in Arkansas somewhere, you know. So, and one of the people with me was so moved where he just blurted out, he said, I'll finance it. He said, you just tell me what you want. I'll set you up. But it was funny. But then I got down on my knees to look into the eyes of this very small 15-year-old boy. And I said, I know you've been sick a lot. I know you've only done 3 years of school. I want you to look at me and tell me you're not going to quit. And for the first time, he threw his head back and laughed. He said, quit? I'm going to stay until I become a doctor so I can help other kids like me who won't get as sick as I did. Now, I don't know if this kid's going to make it or not. But the point is, can you imagine? Would you have that kind of gumption if you had lived how he had lived? But he has his dreams. We forget that at our peril. When I was doing this work after the tsunami in Indonesia, one of the worst things I had to do is go into the camps in Indonesia where people were living long after the tsunami in these hot tents and tin roof houses in India. It's the hardest thing after any natural disaster to get the housing right again. It's just hard to do. So there were thousands of people living in this camp. And there were 40,000 total still in the camps after I said they'd be out of them. So I decided to go take a few lumps and tour one. And I had a wonderful interpreter who had been an Indonesian television person. This young woman quit so she could work in the camps. She's taking me around. So first thing is I get out of the car, and I'm met by the elected president of the camp association, representing all the people living in this camp, and his wife and his son. They were smiling, glad to see me, thank you, got to show you what the problems are. And then the woman and her son walked away, and the gentleman took me on the tour. But I said to my interpreter, I said, I believe that's the most beautiful child I ever saw in my life. I literally gasped when I looked at this little boy. He had these luminous eyes. He looked like he was going to just levitate in my presence. He was so beautiful. And my interpreter said, yes, he's very beautiful. And before the tsunami, he had 9 brothers and sisters. They're all gone. But here's this guy with a smile on his face, never mentioned it once, only talking about the current needs of the other people in the camp. So we take the tour. We end at the health clinic because they knew I had a special interest in that. And we went through all the things they were doing. And then all of a sudden, I see the camp president's wife shows up again with a newborn baby, 2 days old, in her arms, smiling, happy. And she says, this is our youngest child, the most recently born. And she said, in our culture, the woman stays in bed for 40 days after she has a baby and then gets up and we name the child. I hesitate to mention that here. It could lead to a radical change in things in Canada. But she said, I just talked to the mother and the father, and they want you to name the child in honor of your visit. So I said to my interpreter, ask her if what the word in your language is for new beginning. Because there were lots of people, 250,000 people died in this tsunami. So she talks to the woman, they talk, and she turns around and she said, lucky for you. In our language, the word dawn, D-A-W-N, is a boy's name, not a girl's name. And the mother says to tell you, we will name this boy Dawn, and he will symbolize our new beginning. I'm looking at this woman smiling, holding this baby, realizing she's lost 9 of her 10 children, and she has the courage to go on and do this. And there are people like this all over the world. When I started working in Rwanda after the genocide, I met a woman who told me she awoke in a pool of blood after her village was attacked to see her husband and 6 children lying dead around her. And she screamed out in anger to God that she had been spared. And then she looked at me without blinking and she said, finally I realized I'd been spared for a reason. It couldn't be something as mean as vengeance. So I do what I can to help us begin again. She set up an orphanage and adoption placement services for children in both ethnic groups and placed them in homes without regard to the ethnicity of the parents as part of a national determination to let it go. My foundation buys baskets from a basket cooperative founded by a Tutsi woman and a Hutu woman together. After the genocide, the Tutsi woman had 10 children. 7 were murdered in the genocide. And she was a widow, too, so she had to begin again. The only reason her 3 oldest children survived is they were in the military. They were gone when the village was attacked. And her neighbors sold her out. Where their children had played, they shared meals, but people went crazy. And she knew to begin again with her skills, she had to have someone from the other ethnic group. They had to pull it together. So then they started training women, and more women came. Then they sold these baskets all over the world. Some of you probably have bought them. And so young men came for training. And about a year after they started taking young men, a 26-year-old man came to see her and said, broke down crying, said, you have been so wonderful to me. I can't live with myself anymore. I murdered one of your children. And I know that your older sons are alive and in the military. If you want to send for one of them to come here and kill me, I will work until he comes. It is justice, and I owe you that. And this lady looked at him and said, what good would that do? I forgive you. Get up and go back to work. Now, hard as it is to imagine, making the most of the applications of the human genome, a highly complex scientific endeavor, will require the mentality that you all displayed when you identified with that 15-year-old boy who's about the size of an 8-year-old. When you identified with those parents who lost their 9 kids and had 1 left, when you identified with these people. We simply have to understand that we are blessed to be alive. We should be proud of our own distinct differences, but our common humanity has got to drive every single important calculation of the 21st century. Because even the Nobel Prize winners, and I know McGill just produced 2 in science, are not nearly as smart as they think they are. Nobody is. Nobody is. So we are going to have to stumble into the future together. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, Dr. Clinton, I think that applause says it all. There's not really much I can add, and I intend to add. But after hearing you, this most inspired and moving address, and you mentioned, and to put this on a personal basis, you mentioned the grandchildren that you and Secretary Clinton hope to have. My wife and I are blessed with 5 grandchildren. As it turns out, they all live in the States. They're all U.S. citizens. But I'm convinced of one thing, that based on what you have already accomplished and what you are currently doing and your plans for the future, that your grandchildren and my grandchildren and the grandchildren all over the world will have a brighter future. And we are truly grateful for that. And in the spirit of interdependency, we have honored you today, but you have surely honored us, and for which we are very grateful. Thank you for coming. Congratulations. Thank you, everyone.